each one must catch a snake, and whichever snake has the most rattlers on it, the other one has to cook it.
For decades, the world knew Chuck Norris as an unbreakable force of nature, a man immortalized by legendary toughness, martial arts mastery, and unstoppable action hero dominance. But away from the flashing cameras, martial arts tournaments, and Hollywood blockbusters, the real man carried burdens few ever witnessed. When the quiet finally settled and the private doors of his Texas ranch were open to those who loved him most, what his family discovered wasn't another trophy, a secret fortune, or a Hollywood memoir. Instead, sitting inside an unassuming locked cabinet was a personal artifact and a message that instantly brought everyone in the room to tears, forcing them to confront a reality he had spent a lifetime keeping from the world. If you grew up in the 80s, the 90s, or honestly even the early 2000s, there is almost no way you escaped the gravitational pull of Chuck Norris. He was everywhere. He was the man who roundhouse kicked his way into the cultural consciousness and never once looked back. From dominating martial arts tournaments across the globe to headlining action films that made audiences hold their breath, Norris wasn't just a celebrity. He was a phenomenon, a living, breathing legend that seemed to exist somewhere between reality and mythology. And let's be honest for a second. The internet practically turned him into a god. The Chuck Norris jokes, the memes, the impossible feats of strength that people shared for laughs, they all painted the same picture. A man who could not be hurt, could not be defeated, and could not be stopped. He was the punchline and the punch at the same time. But here is the thing that most people never stop to consider. When an entire planet decides you are indestructible, what happens to the very real, very human person trapped inside that armor? Because long before the memes and the movie posters, Chuck Norris was a kid growing up in poverty in Ryan, Oklahoma. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Chuck was just 12 years old. He was painfully shy, painfully thin, and painfully aware that the world had no intention of handing him anything. He didn't stumble into martial arts because it looked cool on a movie poster. He stumbled into it because he was desperate for something, anything, that would make him feel strong in a world that had made him feel powerless. And it worked. He became a 6-time undefeated world professional middleweight karate champion. He fought Bruce Lee in one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history in The Way of the Dragon. He built an empire of action films, television shows, and martial arts schools that stretched across the country. He became the face of toughness itself. The man you didn't mess with. The man who stared down danger and blinked last. But toughness, real toughness, is exhausting. And that is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. Because while the world was busy celebrating his unbreakable exterior, Chuck Norris was quietly absorbing blow after blow behind closed doors. The pressure of maintaining that invincible image wasn't just a professional obligation. It was a psychological cage. Every interview, every public appearance, every fan interaction reinforced the same expectation. You are strong. You are fearless. You never break. So what do you do when you are the man the world believes cannot cry? You learn to swallow everything. You learn to lock away the grief, the fear, the doubt, and the loneliness in places so deep that even the people closest to you cannot find them. And Chuck Norris did exactly that. For decades, he buried the pain of losing his younger brother Wieland in Vietnam. He buried the strain that fame placed on his first marriage. He buried the quiet terror of watching his own body age while the world still expected him to be the same unstoppable force from 1984. He built a fortress around his heart, brick by brick, year by year, until even he sometimes struggled to remember what it felt like to let someone all the way in. And the tragedy is that the fortress worked almost too well. It protected him from the world's expectations, but it also isolated him from the very people he loved the most. And that isolation would eventually drive him to make a decision that nobody saw coming. A decision that would lead him far away from Hollywood, far away from the spotlight, and deep into the quiet solitude of a Texas ranch where the real story of his final years was about to unfold in ways that would leave his family absolutely speechless. By the time Chuck Norris stepped away from the relentless machinery of Hollywood, the man walking through the gates of his sprawling Texas ranch was not the same man who had once kicked through walls on a soundstage in Burbank. The transition wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive press conference, No tearful retirement speech, no viral moment that signaled the end of an era. Instead, it happened the way most profound life changes happen. Slowly, quietly, and almost entirely out of public view. The ranch became his sanctuary. Miles of open land, horses grazing under enormous Texas skies, and a silence so deep you could hear your own heartbeat if you stood still long enough. For a man who had spent the better part of 5 decades surrounded by camera crews, stunt coordinators, and screaming fans, the quiet must have felt both liberating and terrifying. Because when the noise finally stops, the thoughts you have been outrunning your entire life have a way of catching up to you. And catch up they did. Behind those ranch gates, the battles Chuck Norris faced had nothing to do with martial arts opponents or movie villains. They were far more intimate and far more devastating. He was navigating the complex, often painful dynamics of a blended family. His relationship with his children from his first marriage carried decades of unspoken tension, the kind of emotional distance that fame amplifies and time rarely heals on its own. There were estrangements that the tabloids never reported, reconciliations that happened without a single camera present, and conversations that left the toughest man in Hollywood sitting alone in his study long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. His second marriage to Gina O'Kelly brought him a renewed sense of purpose and genuine happiness. But it also introduced new challenges that the public never glimpsed. Gina faced serious health struggles that tested both of them in ways that no action movie script could ever capture. Watching someone you love endure pain that you cannot fight, cannot punch, and cannot roundhouse kick into submission, that is a kind of helplessness that the invincible Chuck Norris persona was never designed to handle. And yet, he handled it. Quietly, privately, without asking for sympathy or attention. But here is where the story takes a turn that even his inner circle did not fully comprehend at the time. As the years passed and his public appearances grew fewer and farther between, those closest to him began to notice something unusual. Chuck Norris, the man who had always been defined by physical action and outward strength, was spending an extraordinary amount of time alone in his private study. Not training, not watching old fight tapes, not managing his business ventures. He was writing. He was organizing. He was carefully assembling something with a level of precision and secrecy that felt almost out of character for a man who had always lived his life in front of the world. Family members would occasionally catch glimpses of documents being shuffled into folders, of old photographs being sorted into specific arrangements, of handwritten notes being sealed into envelopes that were then locked away in a cabinet nobody was allowed to touch. When asked about it, he would deflect with a warm smile and a gentle change of subject, the same way he had deflected emotional vulnerability his entire life. He never raised his voice. He never demanded privacy aggressively. He simply redirected the conversation with the same calm, controlled precision he had once used in the ring. And that restraint, that quiet insistence on keeping this particular endeavor completely hidden, is what should have been the first warning sign. Because Chuck Norris had never been a secretive man when it came to his faith, his family, or his philanthropy. He spoke openly about those things for decades. So whatever he was building behind that locked study door was different. It was personal in a way that transcended anything he had ever shared publicly. And the deeper his family would eventually dig into the contents of that study, the more they would realize that the man they thought they knew had been quietly preparing a final message that would rewrite everything they believed about his last years, and about the true weight of the sacrifices he had been carrying in absolute silence. There is a strange kind of tension that builds inside a household when someone you love starts behaving just slightly out of character. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggers alarm bells or urgent conversations, but in small, almost imperceptible ways that accumulate over months and years until the shift becomes impossible to ignore. And that is exactly what happened inside the Norris household during his final years on the ranch. Chuck Norris had always been a man of routine. Wake up early, train, pray, spend time with family, manage his business interests. It was a rhythm he had maintained with military precision for decades, and everyone around him knew the cadence of his days almost as well as he did. But somewhere along the way, that rhythm began to fracture. The early morning training sessions grew shorter. The business calls became less frequent, and the hours spent behind the closed door of his private study grew longer and longer, stretching well into the evening when the rest of the house had already settled into quiet. At first, the family assumed he was working on a memoir. It made sense, right? A man with his legacy, his decades of extraordinary experiences, his connection to some of the most iconic figures in entertainment history. Of course he would want to put it all down on paper. A few close associates even floated the idea of a publishing deal, imagining a bestseller that would rival the autobiographies of other Hollywood legends. But when the topic was broached, Chuck would wave it off with a soft laugh and say something vague about not being ready yet. The memoir theory slowly faded. Then the speculation shifted. Maybe it was a business venture. Maybe he was quietly building something new, some final entrepreneurial project that he wanted to unveil as a surprise. After all, this was a man who had built martial arts schools, fitness brands, and production companies from the ground up. The idea that he might have one more big play left in him was not far-fetched. But again, the details never materialized. No lawyers were called in. No contracts were signed. No partners were contacted. Whatever was happening inside that study was not a business deal. And that is when the subtle behavioral shifts started becoming impossible to dismiss. Family members noticed that Chuck's conversations had changed. He began asking questions he had never asked before. Deeply personal, almost philosophical questions about legacy, about forgiveness, about whether the people he loved truly understood how much they meant to him. He would sit across the dinner table and study the faces of his children and grandchildren with an intensity that felt different from his usual warmth. It was as if he were memorizing them, as if he were trying to capture every detail of every expression, every laugh, every fleeting moment of connection, and store it somewhere safe inside his mind. He also started making phone calls that he took alone, stepping out onto the porch or retreating to the far end of the ranch where nobody could overhear. The calls were brief, hushed, and clearly emotional. When he returned, his eyes would sometimes carry a redness that he would quickly mask with a joke or a distraction. The man who had spent a lifetime projecting invincibility was suddenly allowing cracks to show. Tiny, almost invisible cracks that most people would have missed entirely. But the most telling detail, the one that would later haunt his family with a mixture of guilt and heartbreak, was the way he began giving away small personal items. A watch here, a signed photograph there, a piece of memorabilia from his fighting days handed to a grandchild with a quiet instruction to hold onto it forever. Individually, these gestures seemed like nothing more than the generosity of an aging patriarch. But collectively, they painted a picture that nobody wanted to see. Because Chuck Norris was not just preparing for the future. He was preparing for an ending. And the locked cabinet in his study was not holding a memoir, a business plan, or a collection of Hollywood memories. It was holding something far more intimate, far more devastating, and far more urgent than anyone in that house could have possibly imagined. And when the day finally came to open that cabinet, what poured out of it would shatter every assumption his family had ever held about the man they thought they knew completely. When the noise of a public funeral finally fades and the television cameras pack up their gear, a terrible, heavy silence descends upon a grieving home. For the Norris family, that silence fell over the Texas ranch like a suffocating blanket. The world had mourned an icon, a legendary martial artist, a box office giant, a symbol of American resilience. Tributes had poured in from heads of state, Hollywood royalty, and millions of fans across every continent. But to the people standing inside the quiet hallways of the ranch, none of those titles mattered. They weren't mourning a superhero. They were mourning a husband, a father, and a grandfather whose absence left a void so vast it felt physically painful. A few days after the services, the family gathered to do what every family must eventually do. Step into the quiet study, sit at his desk, and begin the agonizing process of settling personal affairs. They fully expected the routine, sterile reality of estate administration. They anticipated thick manila folders, trust agreements, real estate deeds, and the rigid legal jargon drawn up by teams of attorneys to protect a lifetime of hard-earned wealth. The study smelled of polished cedar, old leather, and his familiar cologne, a scent that made his physical absence sting even sharper. His desk was immaculately organized, just as he had kept it during his life. But when they sat down and began sorting through his drawers, They quickly realized that the legal paperwork they were looking for had already been forwarded directly to his attorneys weeks earlier. He had handled all of that on his own with typical thoroughness, to spare them the headache. What remained behind in that room was something entirely different. In the corner of the study, set inside an unassuming, hand-carved wooden cabinet that Chuck had kept locked for the last several years of his life, sat a single, heavy antique case. The key to the cabinet had been left inside a plain white envelope on top of his desk, bearing just 3 words in his steady, deliberate script: "For my family." Hands trembling, his loved ones gathered around the desk as the key was slipped into the lock. The brass turned with a quiet, satisfying click that seemed to echo through the empty room. Slowly lifting the heavy wooden lid, they held their breath, expecting perhaps a collection of family heirlooms, old photographs from movie sets, or martial arts championship medals from his legendary fighting career in the 60s and 70s. Instead, resting inside the velvet-lined interior was a series of thick, cream-colored envelopes, each individually labeled by hand with the full name of every single member of his immediate family. Beside the envelopes lay a small stack of handwritten journals and several vintage audio cassette tapes, neatly numbered in sequential order. There were no legal forms, no financial spreadsheets, no instructions on how to manage his public image or his intellectual property. Every single item in that case had been meticulously crafted by hand, preserved in complete secrecy over the final years of his life. As they looked at the familiar, disciplined penmanship, the strong, slanted letters of a man who had survived poverty, war, Hollywood cutthroats, and physical exhaustion, the reality of what he had been doing during all those late, solitary nights in the study finally came crashing down upon them. He hadn't been drafting a commercial memoir or managing a business empire. He had been having an unspoken, deeply private conversation with the people he was about to leave behind. His wife, Gina, reached into the case and picked up the thickest envelope, addressed to her. Her fingers shook as she broke the wax seal. The room went completely still, but as she began reading the opening lines aloud through a veil of tears, the expressions on the faces in that room shifted from quiet grief to utter disbelief. Because what was written on those pages didn't just offer loving goodbyes. It revealed an astonishing truth about a secret burden Chuck had been carrying for his family in silence. A reality so profound that it shattered everything they thought they understood about his final years. To hear the voice of someone you love after they are gone is one of the most powerful, disorienting experiences a human being can endure. But to read the unfiltered, unvarnished confessions of a man the entire world considered unbreakable, that completely rewrites the reality of your grief. As Gina read through the first pages of her letter, the room was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of the paper trembling in her hands. The words on those pages didn't belong to the action superstar, the world champion fighter, or the stoic rancher. They belonged to a husband who had spent decades wrestling with an agonizing silent terror. The fear that despite all his fame, all his money, and all his physical power, he had not been able to shield the woman he loved from life's unavoidable cruelties. In his letter, Chuck laid bare every quiet moment of helplessness he had swallowed during her long health struggles. He confessed to sitting in hospital waiting rooms, gripping his knees until his knuckles turned white, feeling completely shattered by the realization that all the strength in the world couldn't stop physical suffering. He apologized for the moments when his stoic nature made him seem distant, explaining that the stone-faced armor he wore wasn't born out of coldness. It was the only way he knew how to stop himself from falling apart when the family needed him to stand upright. Then came the letters to his children. For years, there had been natural unspoken fractures, wounds left by grueling production schedules, cross-country tours, and the overwhelming gravity of living under the shadow of a global icon. But inside those envelopes, Chuck did something extraordinary. He removed every defense. He didn't make excuses. He didn't hide behind his accomplishments or the financial security he had built for them. Instead, he acknowledged every missed birthday, every late arrival, and every conversation cut short by the demands of an unrelenting career. He wrote to each child with breathtaking specificity, recalling small, intimate memories they assumed he had long forgotten. A conversation in a truck on a summer afternoon, a nervous smile before a school event, a quiet glance exchanged across a crowded room. And then, they pressed play on the first cassette tape. Hearing his voice fill that cedar study was almost unbearable. His tone was low, weathered, and deeply intimate. It lacked the theatrical punch of his movie dialogue. Instead, it carried the gentle, steady warmth of a father speaking directly across a kitchen table. On the tapes, he spoke of his deepest unhealed wound. The loss of his younger brother, Wieland, who had been killed in action in Vietnam. Chuck admitted that he had spent the rest of his life fighting to protect everyone around him because he couldn't save his brother. The fame, the training, the discipline. It had all been an unconscious attempt to build a shield thick enough to keep tragedy from touching his family ever again. He stripped away 50 years of mythology with pure, unadulterated honesty. The man who had defeated countless on-screen armies was confessing that his greatest victory in life had simply been loving them, and that his greatest fear had been leaving them without knowing how much they meant to him. Tears flowed freely as the family embraced. United by a profound sense of closure they hadn't even realized they were searching for. But as Gina carefully returned the letters to the case, her hand brushed against a separate, dark leather folder tucked beneath the velvet lining at the bottom. Attached to the folder was a single handwritten note addressed to all of them, outlining an undisclosed addendum to his final wishes. A hidden, monumental undertaking that had consumed millions of dollars and countless hours in his final years. And as they turned the first page of that folder, they realized Chuck Norris had made a final, breathtaking promise that reached far beyond the walls of the ranch, setting into motion an incredible chain of events that left everyone in the room stunned. When the leather folder was opened, the family expected to find a traditional estate plan. Perhaps real estate trusts, mineral rights on the Texas land, or distribution schedules for his personal assets. Instead, what lay beneath the cover was an astonishing ledger of quiet, anonymous devotion that spanned more than 3 decades. For all the public charity work Chuck Norris had championed throughout his life, including his famous Kickstart Kids Foundation which brought martial arts values into public schools, this folder revealed an entirely different world of giving. A world where his name was completely erased. Document after document detailed the quiet establishment of private trusts, medical debt cancellations, and blind endowments. Millions of dollars had been funneled through anonymous legal entities directly to the families of fallen service members, specifically those who had lost sons, brothers, and fathers in overseas combat. Every single grant had been delivered without a return address, accompanied only by a brief, unsigned card that read, "From a brother who remembers." The family sat in stunned silence as the reality washed over them. Chuck had not simply honored his brother Wieland in private prayer. He had turned his entire financial legacy into a silent shield for hundreds of families, walking through the same agonizing grief that had broken his own heart in 1970. He had never used these donations for tax celebrations, public relations campaigns, or self-serving documentaries. He deliberately ensured that not a single recipient would ever know the identity of their benefactor. And it didn't stop with military families. The ledger uncovered fully funded college accounts for the children of former stunt performers who had been injured on his film sets decades earlier. It showed mortgages paid off for elderly neighbors in rural Oklahoma who had known him when he was just a skinny, impoverished kid with no future. It documented pediatric cancer treatments paid in full for strangers he had read about in local newspapers, always handled through third-party attorneys sworn to absolute confidentiality. As his children flipped through the records, tears once again filled the room. Not of sorrow, but of overwhelming reverence. They began to understand the true purpose behind the long hours he had worked, the relentless commercial endorsements he had taken even into his senior years, and the modest lifestyle he had maintained on the ranch despite his vast fortune. He wasn't hoarding wealth, nor was he clinging to the spotlight for vanity. He was actively using his platform as an engine to quietly rescue as many people as he possibly could before his time ran out. This was the definition of strength he had spent a lifetime trying to embody. In an industry defined by vanity, applause, and desperate bids for attention, Chuck Norris had chosen the path of absolute invisibility. He had understood that real power doesn't come from forcing the world to acknowledge what you have done. It comes from lifting the heavy burdens of others while demanding nothing in return. Yet, as they reached the final page of the leather binder, the atmosphere in the study shifted once more. Taped to the inside of the back cover was an envelope marked with a bold, underlined stamp. Confidential addendum. To be read only after all other letters. Inside was a single legal covenant and a series of cryptic coordinates tied to a secure private facility in Dallas. Attached to the deed was a brief, handwritten instruction that stopped his wife Gina in her tracks. The document revealed that beyond the charity, beyond the letters, and beyond the financial gifts, Chuck had left behind one final, hidden physical repository. Something he had spent the last 2 years of his life constructing in complete isolation. And the purpose of this final creation would challenge everything they believed about how his story was meant to end. Following the coordinates left in that final document led the Norris family to a quiet, nondescript private archival vault in Dallas. When the heavy steel door was unlocked and swung open, what greeted them was not a commercial showroom or a museum of Hollywood glory. There were no movie posters framed in gold, no martial arts tournament belts on display, and no cinematic memorabilia intended for a future public auction. Instead, the climate-controlled room was lined with shelves of meticulously preserved family histories, digitized home movies spanning 50 years, and personal audio files recorded in the quietest hours of his final months. Chuck had spent his last 2 years constructing a private sanctuary dedicated entirely to the preservation of his family's generational story. It was an enduring physical anchor built solely to ensure that his children, his grandchildren, and the generations not yet born would always know where they came from, the values that sustained them, and the unyielding love that had watched over them from the very beginning. Standing in that quiet room, the final pieces of the puzzle snapped into place with absolute clarity. For over half a century, modern pop culture had obsessed over the myth of Chuck Norris. The world had turned him into an invincible icon, a warrior who felt no pain, shed no tears, and could never be defeated by any force on earth. But looking around that vault, surrounded by the physical evidence of his quiet devotion, his family saw the truth. The greatest battle of Carlos Ray Norris had never taken place inside a karate ring or on a soundstage in California. His greatest battle had been fought in the private corners of his own soul, choosing every single day to be a gentle protector, a humble servant, and a man who willingly absorbed the weight of the world so the people he loved would never have to carry it alone. That is why his family wept. It wasn't merely the heartbreak of his physical absence. It was the overwhelming realization of how profoundly he had loved them in total silence. In an industry and an era where every good deed is broadcast for public validation, Chuck Norris had chosen the sacred path of absolute humility. He understood a truth that most people spend an entire lifetime searching for. True strength is never measured by the opponents you overpower with physical force, but by the burdens you carry for others with an open heart. The invulnerable action star was just the armor. The real man inside was defined by an enduring, selfless devotion that never faltered. As they stood together inside that Dallas vault, holding the letters, the recordings, and the records of lives he had quietly saved, the Norris family realized that his passing had not diminished his presence. His voice, his unshakable faith, and his quiet sacrifices had been woven permanently into the fabric of who they were. They had stepped into his study days earlier carrying the heavy weight of unbearable loss, but they walked away with something far greater. The profound peace of knowing that the legacy he built in secret could never be diminished by time, distance, or death. Yet, just as they prepared to turn off the lights and step back into the Texas sun, one final detail caught their attention at the bottom of the central shelf. Resting beneath a layer of protective felt was a small, heavy steel lockbox accompanied by an antique brass key. Taped to the lid was a final handwritten card bearing a date stamped precisely 10 years into the future, along with strict legal instructions that the box was not to be opened a single day earlier. Inside sits one last master recording, a final, undisclosed testament that holds the missing piece of his greatest untold story, leaving his family to wonder what ultimate truth Chuck Norris chose to leave waiting in the silence. Tucked at the very bottom of the case lay a sealed vault key accompanied by a handwritten date set years into the future, guarding one final unreleased recording that holds the missing piece of his life's greatest untold story, leaving his family with a life-altering choice they never anticipated.